Hello and welcome. Today we are going to be talking for probably a medium amount about the Carnival of Venice and all the sorts of arrangements and versions of this particular piece. The genesis of it is a folk tune called the Carnival of Venice, which is about a carnival in Venice. And they have an annual carnival, meaning it happens every year, and the particular tune is about 8 bars long. It's not particularly complicated. It sounds a little bit like this. And this particular tune has been the inspiration for a phenomenal amount of arrangements, variations and versions that use that simple 8-bar melody as its musical motif. One of the first famous versions was done by the great New Zealand violinist and composer Nick Paganini. He did that several hundred years ago. He wrote a series of 20 different variations on this particular tune, virtuosic variations, absolutely crazy. Some of the other famous composers to do it were the other great New Zealand composer Frank Liszt. He did a series of arrangements on the Carnival of Venice. This, however, isn't really a general classical music channel. This is a brass music channel. So we're going to be focusing today on 3, maybe 4 particular brass-orientated versions of the Carnival of Venice. We've got the great version by J.B. Arbon, who is dead. We have another great version by Herbert Clark, who is, well, we've buried him, so he's probably also no longer with us. And then the last version by Del Stagers. I'm also going to talk a little bit about a stupid version, not stupid because it's stupid, but stupid because it's too difficult for me, version by the great Alan Vizzuti. Of the 3 different versions we're looking at today, the Arbon's, Clark and Stagers version, the Arbon's is much longer than the other 2. And it achieves that not necessarily by having more variations, but by sort of packing 2 variations into one. Every one of the 4 variations that appears in the Arbon's has sort of 2 sections to it. So for instance, if you look at the original, the expostulation of the theme, you've got the theme, and then you sort of have an elaboration on the theme packed within the same section of the music. And then when you look at the first variation, you've got the first variation, and then something that is supplementary to that, yet still quite different, yet isn't a separate variation according to the music. I'm not sure why that was done, because for instance, if you look at Niccolo Paganini's version of it, there are 20 variations. All of them are quite short. They get through them pretty quickly, and so that 20 variation arrangement isn't actually as long as you might think. The Arbon's version starts with a fairly long introduction that has little thematic resemblance to the main melody. It sounds a bit like this. The Clark and Stagers versions, on the other hand, start with cadenzas. The Clark version is like this. the Steigers version is like this. On the Arbans version, after you've recited the theme, you then have the second half of the main theme, which should actually be called a first variation because it is a variation to my mind at least, and that sounds like this. The Clark and Steigers version, however, are identical in their next section, their first variation, and they have a lovely set of flowing semiquavers. The next section is quite interesting to me because all of them are very, very similar. The notes are the same for the most part. Certainly the general idea of the next section is the same. The articulation, the dynamics, however, are a little bit more different. The Arbans version follows very much a statement and reply response, which is something that is a theme of the Arbans version, the statement and response in quick succession. Throughout the whole thing. The Steigers is a little bit similar in that where we've got the first recitation of a musical motif in forte, and then piano, and then forte and piano. The Clark version, on the other hand, has the first phrase forte, the second phrase piano. So you've got the same statement and response idea, but at a different pace. So for the twiddly bits, the Arbans sounds like this. Clark sounds like this. And Steigers sounds like this. Once we've gotten through that twiddly section, we then split off. Each of the three composers has taken a different course with what finishes this section of the second variation. Arbans does it this way. Clark does it this way. And Steigers does it this way. Clark and Steigers then go on to the final variation, whilst Arban finds much more material with which to please our ears. After all of that, we have the finale. Now the finale for Clark and Arbans follows the old formula where we have the melody as staccato accented notes whilst we have an underlying ripple of twiddly bits. The Arbans sounds like this. The Clark sounds like this. Steger's, on the other hand, has got a completely different finale section. The first part sounds like this. And the second part is a triplet version of the same finale that we have with Clark and Arbans, and sounds like this. Once we've got through all of that material, we then sign off the piece, the musical performance, with something of a flourish. Despite the Arbans piece being very long and not really having any cadenzas to speak of, we have a rather subdued finishing, which sounds like this. The Clark version has a bit more of a flourish, with its ending sounding like this. Steger's version is pretty similar to Clark's, but instead of having an little optional part there, it's all prescribed what you should play, and it sounds like this. Those three pieces there were the three most common versions of the Carnival of Venice for brass instruments. However, they are by no means the only ones. There are dozens of versions of the Carnival of Venice out there, as well as dozens of versions for all manner of other instruments. Probably the most diabolical one that I have seen for brass instruments, though, is the version done by Alan Vizzuti. This version is so out of this world that it's not called the Carnival of Venice, it's called the Carnival of Venus. And it starts with notes that I don't know how to play in the context that they are written. Specifically, we've got 2 3-octave arpeggios, up and down as fast as you can. Now, whilst the audience is picking up their jaws off the floor from hearing that opening flourish, we then have a deceptively difficult set of opening phrases. This is just more puffery, really, before we get to the actual theme. It sounds a little bit like this. Once we get through that, it's time for the theme. But it's not the theme as you would know it. The theme is spread across several different octaves, making it really, really hard. The next section follows perhaps what we might call the Clark formula by having lovely flowing sets of semiquavers, except they're faster and harder. it is hard for me to continue the will to live when I try to play this particular section, so the first couple of bars of it sound like this. The next section looks like this. It looks like this. I'll attempt to play it, but I don't really know if there's going to be any resemblance to the tune. Variation 3, yes, we're only at Variation 3, and yet I've seen more notes than I knew existed, is a set of arpeggios, and trying to play them accurately, well, I frankly give up. Variation 4 is our slower section, a time to reflect on our lives, something I do not encourage you to do if you're looking at this piece of music for the first time. It looks like it should be relatively straightforward, but the awkward interval jumps, the constant high range, and the sort of trying to phrase low stuff and high stuff all within the same phrase is deceptively difficult, as of course it would be. Thanks, Mr. Vizzuti. The next variation I'm not even going to bother to try and play. It includes one of my most hated musical devices, which is the repeated octave jumps. The finale section is another bucket of misery. It looks like this. I can't play it. You'll have to imagine what it sounds like. And then we have a final cadenza with a final flourish, none of which I'm going to try and play. You may be wondering why I have included a piece that I cannot play in this video of the Carnival of Venice, and I've included it because I find it interesting at an academic level. It's a real juxtaposition between the simple, familiar 8-bar Carnival of Venice folk tune combined with notes in a particular order that make no sense, phrases that I could never play in a million lifetimes, and stuff that is just way beyond any pinnacle of musicianship that I'll ever reach. And those two sort of elements combining in such a show-off fashion is absolutely fascinating to me. I'm sort of fortunate in that I have enough ability to recognize how much talent and practice and work this takes, whilst still being completely humbled and have my nose rubbed in the dirt by the fact that I could never do it myself. So hats off to anyone that can actually play it. This video has been quite long enough. Thank you very much for watching. If you have any further questions about the Carnival of Venice, please pop them in the video below. If you actually managed to watch this whole thing in its entirety, please comment the word cabbage, and I will be able to know who's watched. Fantastic. Thank you very much for joining me tonight.